In the shadowed hollows of the Missouri Ozarks, where the ancient hills whispered secrets to the wind, the year 1876 brought the Fenwick family to a forgotten corner of the world. Elias Fenwick, a stern man with calloused hands from years of labor in distant mills, had uprooted his wife Clara and their wide-eyed daughter Amelia from the clamor of St. Louis. They sought refuge in a modest cabin perched on the edge of a dense forest, its timbers groaning like weary bones under the weight of isolation. The air hung heavy with the scent of damp earth and wild honeysuckle, but beneath it lurked something sharper, a faint, metallic tang that clawed at the back of the throat. At first, the nights were peaceful, broken only by the distant hoot of an owl or the rustle of leaves. But as the moon waxed full, faint murmurs began to drift from the trees, like echoes of conversations long silenced. Clara dismissed them as the wind playing tricks, her voice trembling just enough to betray her unease. Elias, ever the pragmatist, sharpened his axe and ventured deeper into the woods, convinced it was nothing more than prowling animals. Little Amelia, however, lay awake in her narrow bed, clutching her quilt as the voices grew clearer, soft, insistent pleas that seemed to know her name, drawing her gaze toward the inky blackness beyond the window. The family had come to hide from their past sorrows, but the Ozarks held its own hidden torments, waiting patiently in the dark. In the crisp autumn of 1876, the Fenwick family crested the last ridge of the Missouri Ozarks in a weathered wagon pulled by two weary mules, their wheels crunching over gravel that seemed to echo louder than it should in the vast silence. Elias Fenwick sat rigid at the reins, his broad shoulders hunched against a chill that had little to do with the dropping temperature. Behind him, Clara clutched a faded shawl around her thin frame, her eyes fixed on the horizon as if she could still see the smoke of St. Louis rising in the distance. Nestled between them on a pile of quilts sat 8-year-old Amelia, her small hands twisting the hem of her dress, cheeks flushed from the long journey and something else, perhaps the first faint stirrings of unease. They had left the city abruptly, without farewell to neighbors or kin. A fire had taken their eldest son the previous winter, a blaze that started in the tenement's stove and devoured half the block before anyone could reach the boy trapped on the upper floor. The grief had settled over the family like a permanent fog, thick and suffocating. Elias, unable to bear the sympathetic glances and whispered condolences any longer, had sold what little remained and purchased sight unseen a parcel of land deep in Taney County, far from railroads, far from people. The real estate notice had promised fertile bottomland and untouched timber, but mostly it promised solitude and escape from memories that followed them like shadows. The cabin they found waiting was smaller than imagined, its logs darkened by decades of rain and smoke, roof sagging under moss and time. A single chimney leaned slightly, as if listening to secrets carried on the wind. Around it stretched dense forest, oak and hickory twisted together in a canopy so thick that sunlight arrived only in fractured pieces. No neighbors for miles, just the occasional distant howl of a wolf or the sharp cry of a hawk overhead. Elias unloaded their belongings with grim efficiency while Clara swept out layers of dust and mouse droppings, her movements mechanical, her lips pressed thin. Amelia wandered the clearing, trailing her fingers along the rough bark of trees that seemed older than any building she had ever known. That first night, they ate a simple supper of cornbread and salt pork by the light of a single lantern. The fire crackled in the hearth, throwing long shadows across the walls, and for a few hours the exhaustion of travel granted them fitful sleep. But toward midnight, when the moon hung swollen and pale above the treetops, the air grew unnaturally still. Clara woke first, heart pounding for no reason she could name. She lay listening to the silence, then heard it, a low murmur drifting through the chinked walls, too soft to make out words yet unmistakably human. Elias stirred beside her, muttering that it was only wind threading through the branches. Yet as the hours crept on, the sound returned, rising and falling like distant conversation, voices overlapping in tones both pleading and sorrowful. Amelia, in her tiny cot by the window, pressed her hands over her ears, eyes wide in the darkness, certain that whatever spoke beyond the trees already knew they had arrived. A week after settling in, Elias rose before dawn, the whispers from the woods having grown bolder each night, threading through his dreams like smoke he couldn't shake. He told Clara he was scouting for firewood and game trails, but in truth he needed to confront whatever mocked their sleep. Axe slung over his shoulder, lantern swinging low, he followed a faint path that twisted deeper into the forest than any sensible man would venture alone. The trees closed ranks quickly, their trunks thick and scarred, branches interlaced so tightly that only thin blades of morning light pierced the gloom. The air grew cooler, heavier, carrying the damp rot of leaves that had never seen full sun. Elias pressed on, boots sinking into moss that felt unnaturally soft, as though the ground itself breathed beneath him. After nearly an hour the trail narrowed to nothing, yet something pulled him forward, an instinct he couldn't name, the same stubborn pull that had driven him from the city. Then the woods opened without warning into a small clearing no wider than the span of his outstretched arms. At its center stood a cabin far older than his own, its logs blackened by time and fire, roof collapsed inward like a broken ribcage. Vines had claimed the walls, thick as pythons, yet the doorframe remained upright, defiant. Elias approached slowly, lantern raised, heart thudding against his ribs with a rhythm that felt borrowed from the forest itself. Inside, the single room lay in ruin, a stone hearth choked with ash, a rotted table split down the middle, shards of crockery glittering in the dust. But it was the walls that stole his breath. Every visible log bore carvings, hundreds of them etched deep with a blade that had trembled in its wielder's hand. Figures writhed across the wood, men and women with elongated limbs, mouths stretched impossibly wide in silent screams, eyes reduced to hollow circles that seemed to follow his movement. Some clutched at their throats, others reached skyward as if pleading with unseen forces. Interwoven among them were symbols Elias didn't recognize, spirals that coiled inward forever, jagged lines that intersected like lightning frozen mid-strike. He stepped closer, running calloused fingers over the grooves. The wood felt warm, almost feverish, though the air inside was cold enough to cloud his breath. In one corner, a larger panel depicted a family, father, mother, child, standing at the edge of a clearing much like this one, while shadowy forms emerged from the tree line behind them. The child's carved face bore an expression of pure terror, mouth open as though calling out. Elias jerked his hand away, suddenly certain the whispers he'd heard at night originated here, rising from these very walls. Dust motes danced in the frail light of his lantern as he circled the room, searching for anything that might explain the madness preserved in wood. Beneath a fallen beam he found a rusted iron latch, half buried, leading to nothing now but earth. Whatever had been hidden there was long gone. Still, the carvings pressed in on him, their anguish palpable, until the small hairs on his neck rose and the lantern flame guttered though no wind stirred. He backed toward the doorway, axe gripped tight, unable to shake the feeling that the tormented figures weren't warnings, they were promises. As the days shortened and frost began to silver the grass each morning, little Amelia Fenwick found herself drawn to the edges of the clearing more often than her mother liked. Clara would call her back sharply, voice edged with a fear she tried to disguise as ordinary scolding, but the child's feet carried her anyway toward the tree line where sunlight thinned and the air tasted different, cooler, older, laced with something that made her skin prickle. It started with her name. One afternoon while gathering kindling near a cluster of cedars, Amelia froze mid-reach, certain she had heard a soft voice say Amelia from somewhere deeper in the woods. Not her mother's voice, not her father's, something lighter, breathier, like a sigh carried on the wind. She turned, expecting to see a neighbor she didn't know existed, but only shadows shifted between the trunks. She told herself it was imagination, the way city children invented playmates from nothing, and hurried home with her arms full of sticks. But the voice returned, always at twilight when the sky bled from gold to bruised purple. It grew familiar, almost gentle, repeating her name as though tasting it, drawing the syllables out until they curled like smoke, Amelia. Some evenings it came from the left, others from the right, never loud enough to wake her parents but clear enough that she began answering in whispers, pressing her face to the cold window glass. One evening, after a supper of thin stew that barely filled their bowls, Amelia slipped out while her parents argued quietly over whether to burn the last of their lamp oil. The voice had called 3 times already, closer than ever, and curiosity overpowered the fear that usually rooted her to the doorstep. Barefoot, she followed the sound along a dear path she had never noticed before, moss soft and damp beneath her soles. The trees leaned inward, guiding her, until the path spilled into a tiny hollow hidden by a thicket of dogwood. There, half covered in vines and fallen leaves, lay a flat stone no larger than a washtub. Amelia knelt, brushing away decades of debris, heart fluttering like a trapped moth. The stone was weathered but deliberate, its surface etched with letters worn soft by rain and time. She traced them with trembling fingers. Fenwick. Beneath the surname, smaller marks suggested a first name and dates, but erosion had stolen most of the detail. Only the year 1849 remained legible, carved deeper than the rest as though pressed by a desperate hand. The voice spoke again, directly behind her now, so close she felt the chill of it on her neck. This time it formed words beyond her name, fragments. Really, come, stay, remember. Amelia spun around, but the hollow was empty save for drifting mist that rose unnaturally from the ground. Tears welled hot in her eyes, not from sorrow but from a sudden, overwhelming sense that the stone belonged to someone who had once been small like her, someone the woods had never let leave. She backed away until thorns caught her dress, then ran all the way home, the voice trailing after her like ribbon, soft and patient, promising it would wait to be by mid-November. The Fenwick family's small herd, 2 milk cows, a handful of chickens, and the old sow Elias had bartered for in Branson, began to waste away in ways that defied hunger or sickness. The first to go was a speckled hen, found at dawn behind the lean-to with its neck twisted backward, eyes wide and glassy, yet not a drop of blood on the straw. Elias muttered about foxes and buried the bird deep, but the next morning brought another, this one split open from breastbone to vent, entrails arranged in a perfect circle around the body as though placed there by careful hands. Clara refused to eat the eggs after that. She poured them onto the ground each morning, watching the yolks run pale and watery, whispering prayers under her breath that sounded more like bargains. The cows grew restless, lowing through the nights in tones that rose and fell like human weeping. Their milk soured in the pail before it could be carried inside, thick with dark clots that smelled faintly of iron. Elias checked the pasture fence twice daily, finding no breach, no tracks larger than a raccoon's, yet every few days another animal bore fresh wounds, long, shallow slashes across the flanks, precise as a butcher's cuts but without the mercy of depth. The sow lasted longest, stubborn and mean-tempered, rooting defiantly at the frozen earth. One frost-heavy evening, Amelia heard the pig's frantic squeals from her bed and woke her father. Elias grabbed the lantern and rifle, boots unlaced, and ran into the yard. The sow lay on her side in the pen, belly heaving, 3 parallel gashes glistening black in the lantern light. No predator had entered, the gate latch remained fastened from the inside. The wounds wept slowly, but what chilled Elias most was how the cuts curved almost graceful, like letters in a script he couldn't read. He slaughtered the animal at first light, working quickly to salvage what meat he could. As he skinned her, he found the slashes continued beneath the hide, carved into the muscle itself, deeper than any claw could reach without tearing flesh away. The pattern repeated on both sides, 3 curving lines that met at a point, over and over, as though something had signed its name across her body. Clara watched from the doorway, arms wrapped tight around herself, refusing to come closer. Amelia stood beside her, silent, eyes fixed on the dark tree line where the morning mist lingered longer than it should. That night, no one slept. The remaining cow moaned in the shed, a low, continuous note that seemed to answer something deeper in the woods. Elias sat by the fire with the rifle across his knees, reloading and unloading it until the mechanism gleamed. The air inside the cabin grew thick with the smell of blood that wouldn't wash from his hands no matter how hard he scrubbed. Outside, the frost hardened, and whatever moved between the trees left no footprints for the morning light to reveal. As December deepened and the Ozarks surrendered to winter's grip, the nights grew longer than the days, the sky a low iron lid that pressed down on the cabin until the walls themselves seemed to lean inward. One evening, the wind rose sudden and fierce, driving sheets of rain against the roof like thrown gravel. Elias banked the fire high, barring the door with a log too heavy for one man to lift alone, while Clara huddled with Amelia beneath a patchwork quilt that smelled of smoke and fear. The storm peaked near midnight, thunder rolling through the hills like artillery from a forgotten war. Lightning strobed white through the chinks, freezing the room in stark flashes that made shadows leap and retreat. Then, between the crashes, the voices returned, not whispers now, but a chorus rising clear above the gale. They poured from the woods in overlapping waves, dozens at once, some close enough to rattle the window latch, others distant yet carrying as though funneled straight into the ears. Elias stood at the door, rifle in hand, straining to separate words from the roar. Fragments reached him, names long out of use, pleas in accents he half remembered from childhood stories of early settlers. A woman's voice sobbed about children lost in the snow, a man cursed the day he broke ground near the old hollow, another begged forgiveness for promises broken to the land itself. The voices braided together into ragged tales of families who came seeking the same solitude the Fenwicks craved, of fever summers and barren winters, of figures seen at the tree line that wore familiar faces but moved wrong. Clara pressed her hands to her ears, rocking slightly, yet the sound seeped through her fingers. Amelia sat rigid, eyes enormous in the firelight, listening as though the storm spoke directly to her. The child's lips moved silently, repeating phrases she could not possibly know. Blood for the roots, bound to the circle, never leave the mark. Rain hammered harder, wind screaming through the eaves, but the voices rode atop it all, growing more insistent, more desperate, until they seemed to come from inside the cabin as much as out. Lightning struck close, close enough to shake dust from the rafters and fill the air with the sharp tang of scorched earth. In that blinding instant, Elias saw them through the window, pale shapes moving between the trees, too tall, too thin, arms raised as if conducting the storm itself. The thunder that followed drowned their cries for one heartbeat, but when it faded the voices surged again, clearer than ever, recounting vanishings from decades past, whole households gone overnight, livestock drained, cabins found empty with doors still barred from within. The family sat frozen until the rain began to slacken near dawn, the wind dying to a mournful sigh. Only then did the chorus thin, retreating into the dripping woods like a tide pulling back. Yet even as grey light crept across the floorboards, faint echoes lingered, threading through the patter of leftover drops, promises, or threats, that the storm had only been the beginning. After the storm, Elias could no longer dismiss the voices as tricks of wind or weary minds. The livestock were nearly gone, the cabin stores dwindling, and the weight of unspoken dread pressed harder each day. Driven by a grim determination to understand what stalked them, he returned to the ruined cabin in the clearing, this time by daylight, carrying a crowbar and a small spade along with his axe. The place looked smaller in the pale winter sun, less menacing yet somehow more sorrowful, as though the carvings on the walls had wept through the night. Elias pried at the collapsed hearthstones until his shoulders burned, searching for anything that might explain the madness etched into the wood. Beneath a slab near the back wall, the crowbar struck something hollow. He worked the stone loose and revealed a narrow cavity lined with rotted leather. Inside lay a journal, its cover warped and blackened, pages brittle as dead leaves. The handwriting belonged to a man named Obadiah Fenwick, dated entries spanning the 1840s, spidery script that grew increasingly frantic toward the end. Elias carried it home wrapped in his coat, waiting until Amelia slept before spreading the fragile volume on the table by lamplight. The early pages described a family much like his own, settlers drawn to the Ozarks by promises of rich soil and isolation. They built on this very parcel, clearing timber, planting corn, confident in their claim. But crops failed season after season, wells ran bitter, and children sickened with fevers no poultice could break. Obadiah wrote of whispers that began softly, then grew demanding, speaking of old bargains made by the first peoples who hunted these hills, offerings to keep the land fertile, to hold something older at bay. Desperate after burying 2 daughters, Obadiah and his neighbors turned to a traveling preacher who claimed knowledge of binding rites. Together they performed a ritual in the clearing at new moon, a circle of salt and ash, blood from each family's healthiest animal, words spoken in a tongue none fully understood. They sought protection, abundance, peace. Instead, the journal claimed, they woke something that had slept beneath the roots. The final entries were scrawled, ink blotched as though the pen shook violently. Obadiah described shadows that wore the faces of the dead, voices that named sins aloud in the dark, livestock found arranged in patterns that mirrored the circle. He confessed the ritual had not summoned aid, it had torn a veil, trapping restless spirits in the woods, binding them to the bloodlines of those who spilled the offering. The families tried to flee, but fog rose, paths looped, and one by one they returned, drawn back by voices wearing the tones of lost children. Elias read until the lamp guttered low, the name Fenwick staring up from every page like an accusation. Clara watched him from the shadows, face pale, knowing without asking that the journal held no salvation, only the reason the woods had waited patiently for their arrival. With the journal's revelations burning behind his eyes, Elias watched his wife Clara change in ways that chilled him more than the winter wind seeping through the chinks. She had always been quiet since the loss of their son, her grief a private country she visited alone, but now something darker walked beside it. At supper she stared past the flickering lamp as though listening to conversation no one else could hear, her spoon hovering forgotten above the bowl. When spoken to, she answered slowly, words trailing off like smoke. The nightmares began soon after the storm. Elias woke to find her side of the bed cold, the quilt thrown back in haste. He found her standing at the window in her nightgown, forehead pressed to the frosted glass, breath fogging and clearing in rapid bursts. She murmured names he did not know, children's names, soft and pleading, her fingers tracing patterns on the pane that matched the carvings he had seen in the ruined cabin. When he led her back to bed she went willingly, eyes half-lidded, but sleep brought no peace. Night after night the dreams pursued her. She described them in the grey mornings, voice flat and distant, as though recounting another woman's torment. Shadowy figures waited at the edge of the clearing, their faces obscured yet achingly familiar. They beckoned from the tree line, arms outstretched, mouths moving in silent urgency. When she tried to turn away, the ground softened beneath her feet, pulling her toward the hidden grave Amelia had found. The stone bore fresh carving each time, her own name appearing letter by letter while the figures closed in, cold hands brushing her skin, whispering that she belonged with them now. The sleepwalking started subtly. Elias tied a string of bells to the bedpost, but Clara moved with unnatural silence, slipping past him into the main room. One dawn he followed her footprints in the fresh snow, bare feet leaving perfect prints that led straight to the woods before circling back. She stood at the threshold when he caught her, eyes open yet vacant, lips forming the same plea, "Let me go to them." Amelia clung to her mother during the days, small hands clutching Clara's skirts, but even the child grew wary when Clara's gaze drifted too long toward the trees. The woman's skin took on a pallor that no fire could warm, dark circles deepening beneath eyes that seemed to see through walls into whatever waited beyond. Elias barred the door with extra timber each night, yet he knew locks meant nothing against what called her. The voices had found a new way inside, threading through her dreams, drawing her step by step toward the dark heart of the woods where the stone with their name waited patiently beneath the frost. By late January, with snow blanketing the hills in a silence that felt deliberate, Elias made the decision they had circled for weeks. They would leave at first light, take only what the wagon could carry, and head north toward Springfield or beyond, anywhere the trees did not press so close. He spoke little as he packed, movements sharp and economical, loading sacks of cornmeal, the last salted pork, blankets thick enough to blunt the cold. Clara nodded without protest, her eyes hollow but focused, helping fold clothes with hands that no longer trembled. Even Amelia seemed lighter, humming fragments of an old lullaby as she bundled her rag doll and a single picture book. They rose before dawn, the sky still bruised with night, breath pluming white in the lantern glow. Elias hitched the remaining mule while Clara secured the tailgate. The air was bitterly still, frost crackling underfoot, yet something felt off, the usual morning chorus of crows and jays absent, as though the woods held their breath. They climbed aboard, Elias cracking the reins, and the wagon lurched forward down the narrow track that led away from the cabin. Barely 100 yards beyond the clearing, a fog rose sudden and thick from the ground itself, swirling up in heavy coils that swallowed the path ahead. Elias urged the mule onward, but the animal balked, ears flat, refusing to step into the wall of grey. Visibility shrank to arm's length, tree trunks loomed like pale ghosts before vanishing again. He turned the wagon, intending to circle wide, yet after minutes of slow progress the same frost-rimed oaks reappeared on their left, the very ones that bordered their own yard. The track looped impossibly, delivering them back to the cabin again and again no matter which direction he chose. Then the voices began, no longer distant but intimate, sliding from the fog in tones that twisted the heart. Clara's name spoken in the soft cadence of her dead son, Elias hearing his own father's gravelly timbre calling from childhood, Amelia's small gasp as a child's voice, high, sweet, unmistakably her lost brother's, begged her to stay and play. The words wrapped around them, warm as hearth smoke yet cold as grave dirt, promising rest, forgiveness, reunion if they would only turn back. The fog thickened whenever the wagon moved forward, thinning just enough behind them to reveal the dim outline of the cabin waiting like an open mouth. Hours passed unmarked, the sun a faint smear overhead, until exhaustion forced Elias to halt. The mule stood shivering, sides heaving. Clara clutched Amelia close, both of them pale as the snow, listening to beloved voices that should not exist weaving pleas through the mist. Elias gripped the reins until his knuckles split, knowing the woods had closed the way, guiding them gently, relentlessly home. Trapped by the endless fog and the voices that wore the faces of the dead, Elias clung to the one thread of action left in the journal's crumbling pages, a reversal, a way to unbind what Obadiah's ritual had knotted. The instructions were scrawled in the margins, ink faded but legible, salt scattered counterclockwise, ash from a hearth fire mixed with water from the first snowmelt, words spoken backward under a waning moon. Elias gathered what he needed in silence, his jaw set like iron, telling Clara only that he would end it tonight. He waited until the moon hung thin and sharp above the treetops, then slipped from the cabin with a sack over his shoulder and the journal clutched to his chest. The path to the ruined clearing opened for him alone, fog parting just enough to let his lantern's glow guide the way. The old cabin waited as before, but the carvings seemed to pulse faintly, the tormented figures leaning forward as though sensing his intent. Elias worked quickly in the frozen clearing. He scraped a wide circle into the crusted snow, pouring salt in a steady stream while reciting the reversed words under his breath, voice hoarse from disuse. He built a small fire in the collapsed hearth, feeding it splintered beams until the flames leapt high enough to warm the feverish wood of the walls. Then he scattered the ash mixture, watching it hiss where it touched the carved symbols, thin curls of smoke rising like released breath. For a moment the night grew utterly still, no wind, no distant owl, not even the creak of branches. Elias felt a pressure lift from his chest, a lightness that almost brought tears to his eyes. But then the fire flared unnaturally, blue at its heart, and the carvings began to bleed, dark rivulets seeping from the gouged eyes and mouths of the figures, dripping slow and thick onto the snow. The voices returned, no longer pleading but furious, overlapping in a howl that shook snow from the surrounding trees. Shadows detached from the walls, lengthening, thickening, taking forms that moved with purpose. They surged toward him, cold fingers brushing his coat, tugging at the journal until the brittle spine cracked. Elias stumbled back, swinging the lantern wildly, but the flames only fed them, shadows writhing higher. One form solidified before him, tall, elongated, face a hollow smear wearing Obadiah's features twisted in rage. It drove him to his knees, icy pressure crushing his chest, while others circled, their whispers now sharp as blades, betrayer, breaker, thief of rest. The reversal had not closed the tear, it had enraged what lived within it, turning passive torment into active hunger. Elias crawled toward the circle's edge, salt scattering beneath his palms, but the boundary dissolved under the onslaught, snow melting into black water that steamed and stank of rot. The shadows dragged him deeper into the ruin, the journal torn from his grasp and flung into the fire where pages curled and blackened. Pain bloomed across his skin where unseen hands clawed, and the last thing he saw before darkness swallowed the lantern was the carved child on the wall turning its hollow eyes toward him, mouth stretching wider as though finally able to scream as February's frozen grip tightened and the cabin became more prison than refuge. The voices abandoned all pretense of gentleness.